After 12 grueling months aboard the USS Truman, Commander Julia Torres finally returned home, not to a house in the city or a military base, but to the old lake cabin her grandfather built with his bare hands. Nestled in a grove of white pines overlooking Lake Ellington, it had stood untouched for over a year, waiting patiently like an old friend. The air was brisk and clean, the water mirrored the sky, and the cabin's hand-carved beams welcomed her like she'd never left. We'd arrived the night before, exhausted but relieved, towing a small U-Haul and dreams of a quiet month away from duty, noise, and expectations. Julia, in particular, needed this. After 4 tours, medals, and more deployments than most would survive, the cabin was the only place she could breathe deeply without checking her 6-dot. As we unpacked boxes onto the porch, a strange tension hung in the air, not from the cabin or the lake, but from the surrounding silence. There were no neighborly greetings, no curious glances, just stillness, and then shouts. "Hey, you can't be here." We turned to see a woman speed-walking toward us from the adjacent trail, clipboard in hand, posture rigid, late 50s, short bob, mirrored sunglasses perched atop a sun visor. She wore a pastel windbreaker and a scowl that could sour milk. "I'm sorry," Julia asked calmly, squinting against the sun. "This is private property," the woman snapped. "Lake Ellington Shores HOA. Residents only, and I know everyone who belongs here." Julia tilted her head, unmoved. "This cabin belongs to me." "That's impossible," the woman said with a bitter laugh. "No one's lived here in over a year. I've patrolled this sector personally." I stepped down from the porch. "And you are Marlene Whitlock, president of the HOA, and you're trespassing." Julia pulled a key from her pocket and calmly unlocked the cabin's front door. "I inherited this property when my grandfather passed. The deed is in my name." "You're mistaken." Marlene's face darkened like a summer storm. "If you can't produce proof right now, I'll be calling the sheriff. We don't tolerate squatters or unapproved guests." Julia gave a slow, weary sigh, the kind that signaled 1,000 battles already fought. "You want to call the sheriff?" she asked. "I do," Marlene said, already pulling out her phone. "You people think you can do whatever you want." Julia stepped down from the porch, her tone even. "What people, Marlene?" There was a silence sharp enough to cut through bone. "Veterans," Marlene said quickly. "I meant, you military types." I could see Julia's jaw clench ever so slightly. She didn't yell, she didn't push back. She just stared. "Call the sheriff. I'll wait." And she did. Within 15 minutes, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived. Marlene greeted them like royalty, explaining that a suspicious woman had broken into a vacant cabin and refused to leave. She gestured theatrically, her voice trembling with self-importance. The deputies approached the porch. Julia stood ready, ID and deed in hand. "Commander Julia Torres," she said, "Us Navy. This is my property. Here's the deed, and my grandfather's will if you'd like to see that too." The deputies examined the documents quietly, cross-referencing the address and parcel number. After a moment, one looked up and said, "You're all good here, ma'am. This property falls just outside the HOA line." Marlene's voice rose in disbelief. "No, that can't be. This area was included in the boundary revision 2 years ago. We have jurisdiction, not according to county records." The deputy replied, "This parcel's unincorporated. She's not under your authority." Julia folded her arms. "So are we done here?" Marlene didn't reply. Her face, tight with rage, twitched once before she turned and marched back down the path, muttering something about legal action. But the damage had been done. Julia turned to me as the patrol cars disappeared down the lane. "I came here to rest," she murmured, "not to be accused of trespassing on my own land. And now," she looked out at the lake, her gaze hardening like ice over water. "Now, I want to know who this woman thinks she is, and why she believes she owns something she clearly doesn't." In that moment, I knew peace wasn't coming easily. Something told me Marlene wasn't done, and Julia wasn't backing down. By sunrise the next morning, any illusion of tranquility had fully evaporated. Julia stood barefoot on the porch, sipping her coffee, scanning the lake with a 1,000-yard stare. The quiet that once signaled peace now felt like a lull before a storm, and sure enough, the moment I stepped outside, she held up a sheet of paper someone had slipped under our door overnight, a bright orange violation notice, laminated and typed in bold red font. "Greater than you are in violation of the Lake Ellington Shores HOA regulations. Unauthorized occupancy of unregistered dwelling, non-compliant mailbox design, unapproved dock structure, presence of unlicensed animals, CSEC, 3D non-permitted gravel driveway." There were 23 violations in total, each more absurd than the last. Julia stared at the list, deadpan, before finally muttering, "I've seen warlords with fewer rules." She flipped it over, signed in curling cursive by none other than Marlene Whitlock, President, LES HOA. "It's intimidation," I said. "None of this applies to us." Julia nodded slowly. "But she's not playing fair. This isn't about rules, it's about control." We spent the next few hours digging into the county records online. Just as the deputies had said, our cabin, sat outside the HOA's jurisdiction on land zones separately and unbound by their covenants. Julia even found a scanned map from 1987, the year the HOA was chartered. Her grandfather's property was clearly excluded, a single outlined lot, left untouched and independent. The original founders had wanted it included, but Julia's grandfather had refused. He never liked rules he didn't write himself, but it wasn't just about lines on a map anymore. This was personal. Marlene had declared war. Later that afternoon, Julia drove into town to request official copies of the deed and boundary maps. When she returned, I was crouched near the truck, inspecting the tires, all four slashed. I said grimly, "Knife marks, clean straight lines. This wasn't kids messing around." Julia didn't flinch. She took out her phone, snapped pictures, and calmly called the sheriff's office. When the deputy arrived, different from the one yesterday, he was younger, more cautious. He surveyed the damage, nodded, and took notes. But when we told him about Marlene and the violation notice, his body language shifted. "You're not the first," he said under his breath. "Lady's got the whole HOA scared. She's been issuing bogus fines for years. Some folks just pay to avoid the drama." Julia leaned forward. "But that's the problem, isn't it? When people stop pushing back." He met her gaze. "Well, you don't look like someone who folds easily." "I don't." That night, Julia sat at the dining table with the cabin's dusty file boxes spread out in front of her. Old property records, letters from her grandfather, zoning printouts, and a yellowed videocassette labeled HOA Meeting -1991. She digitized it, uploaded it to her laptop and played it. The screen flickered, revealing a shaky recording of an early HOA meeting. In it, her grandfather stood before a folding table of smug-faced committee members. "I'm not signing," he said. "This land's mine. My taxes are current, and I don't want part of your lakefront council or whatever this is." The camera panned to a younger Marlene, still pied and assertive, scowling in the background. The next clip was from a separate town hall meeting where residents debated HOA expansion boundaries. Julia's grandfather stood again, pointing to a map. "You see this line? That's me. You stay on your side of it, and we won't have a problem." Julia paused the video and stared at the screen. He knew this was coming. She whispered. Even 30 years ago, by the time morning broke, she'd emailed a copy of the video to the county clerk, the sheriff's office, and several longtime residents she'd found in the local directory. She also printed out laminated copies of the deed, the boundary map, and a letter asserting her legal independence from the HOA. Then, Julia hammered a wooden post into the edge of the driveway and hung a freshly printed sign, "Greater than private property not under HOA jurisdiction. Any unauthorized contact will be treated as harassment and reported." Later that day, we saw Marlene drive by in her golf cart, her eyes narrowing behind polarized lenses. She didn't stop, but she didn't smile either. The battle lines had been drawn. And Julia, she wasn't just defending a cabin anymore. She was defending legacy, land, and the right to live free of entitled tyrants. The sign didn't scare her off. If anything, it seemed to provoke Marlene further. The next morning, we woke up to a citation stapled directly onto our newly varnished dock, a blatant act of vandalism. The paper flapped in the breeze, and smugly typed, "Greater than non-compliant structure, subject to HOA removal order." Julia tore it down with surgical precision. Her silence wasn't passive. It was a fuse shortening by the second. Later that afternoon, a certified envelope arrived from the HOA. Inside was a cisandizist letter, filled with bloated legal language and threats of civil litigation unless Julia vacated the premises and removed all unlawful structures. The cherry on top, a formal demand to attend an HOA disciplinary hearing. Julia laughed once sharply. "She thinks this is a real court," she muttered, tossing the letter on the table. I watched her pace the cabin, the same woman who had diffused hostage situations in war zones, now cornered by an HOA president drunk on authority. But she wasn't afraid. She was calculating. I gave her a chance to back off. Julia finally said, eyes sharp as broken glass, "Now it's time. We'll show her what real authority looks like." That evening, she met with Harold McKenny, a retired circuit court judge and longtime Lake resident who'd lived 3 doors down since 1982, a man of few words and iron principles. Harold had grown disillusioned with the HOA years ago, but, like many, had kept his head low to avoid conflict. Julia changed that. She showed him the boundary maps, the deed, the harassment letters, and the video of her grandfather refusing inclusion in the HOA. Harold watched in silence, then leaned back, exhaled, and said, "She's overreached for the last time." Together they started building a case. Harold knew how to expose mismanagement. Julia knew how to rally troops. The first strike came the next morning. Julia launched a private Facebook group titled Lake Ellington, Truth and Transparency. Within 24 hours, over 50 residents had joined, including multiple homeowners who shared similar stories: bogus citations, surprise fines, even threats of foreclosure over minor landscaping choices. Then came the discovery that turned anger into Outraged, one of the newer residents, a tech-savvy vet named Kevin, dug through public financial disclosures Marlene had filed with the county. Buried in the HOA's budget reports were line items labeled operational travel, community leadership retreats, and member retention expenses. Kevin tracked the payments to a single credit card used at luxury spas, catered restaurants, and even a Caribbean cruise. Julia posted screenshots with the caption, "How's that $450 violation helping your lawn, Mr. Ellen?" It exploded. Residents who had once paid their dues out of habit were now furious. Many hadn't realized Marlene had unilaterally rewritten the HOA bylaws 2 years prior, extending visual oversight to properties not even under their legal domain like Julia's. A special petition began circulating. It demanded a full audit, a vote of no confidence, and the immediate suspension of Marlene Whitlock pending investigation. That weekend, we held an unofficial town meeting at Harold's property. Over 70 people showed up, some bringing folders full of paperwork, others carrying stories and bruised pride. Julia stood before them not in uniform, but in a plain flannel and jeans, and told them what her grandfather told her as a child. Greater than the moment someone tells you your rights are inconvenient, you better hold on to them tighter. Her voice didn't rise, but her presence commanded the crowd like she was back on the bridge of a ship. "This cabin has stood longer than the HOA has existed. I have the right to be here. And so do you, in your homes, on your land, without fear of some clipboard tyrant redefining the rules as she goes." Applause erupted. That night, the HOA mailbox overflowed with signed petitions. The board was forced to call an emergency meeting. The first agenda item, Marlene's misconduct, but she wasn't going quietly. She fired back with legal threats, claimed slander, and tried to ban Julia from attending the meeting due to non-member status. That was her final mistake, because Julia didn't need permission. She had facts, she had the law, and now she had the neighborhood. Behind her, the next meeting would decide everything, and Julia was ready to deliver the knockout. The Lake Ellington Shores HOA emergency meeting was scheduled for 6 p.m. sharp. By 5:30, every folding chair in the community clubhouse was filled, and still more residents stood along the walls, whispering among themselves with guarded anticipation. Some clutched copies of violation notices, others held printouts of the financial documents Julia had uncovered. The air buzzed with tension, not fear, but the electric kind that comes just before a lightning strike. Julia arrived at 5:59. She walked in calmly, dressed in civilian clothes, but carrying herself with the unmistakable confidence of someone who knew she belonged, who had earned every right to stand her ground at the front of the room. Marlene Whitlock sat behind a long folding table alongside the remaining board members, her hair styled into stiff curls and her lips pursed in a defiant line. She tapped the gavel once, twice. "This meeting," she began, voice slightly too loud, "is hereby called to order. Before we begin, I must state that due to the non-membership status of certain individuals, they will not be permitted to speak during this proceeding." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Julia stepped forward. "Is that so? You are not part of the HOA," Marlene snapped. "You are trespassing again." Harold McKinney stood. "Point of order." Marlene froze. Harold's quiet authority still carried weight. "I moved to suspend the procedural limitations due to the overwhelming interest from community members and the relevance of Ms. Torres' evidence to ongoing HOA practices." The room echoed with voices. "Seconded." I let her speak. Marlene's gavel wobbled in her grasp. "This is highly irregular." Harold overrode her. "You've made things irregular, Marlene. Now sit down." Julia took the floor. She pulled no theatrics, raised no voice. She simply connected the dots from the original boundary maps showing her cabin's exclusion from the HOA to the illegal bylaw revisions Marlene had made without a vote, to the forged citations and false reports. Then she projected the financial records on a portable screen, highlighting the personal expenses tucked under HOA funds. "Here's the breakdown," Julia said, clicking through the pages. $14,000 in unauthorized travel expenses, nearly $9,000 spent on community enrichment with no receipts, a $3,200 charge for a leadership retreat at a 4-star spa resort, all billed under operating costs. She paused, and here's the kicker: Marlene's personal email used as the point of contact on every transaction. Marlene shot to her feet. "This is an ambush. You have no legal authority to speak on our budget." Harold stood again. "Actually, she does, because I filed a subpoena request this morning for a full audit under state HOA compliance law. And based on the evidence presented here tonight, we have probable cause to freeze all HOA accounts until that investigation is complete." The silence that followed was absolute, then applause. Not scattered, not polite, but thunderous and sustained. Marlene tried to shout over it. "You people have no idea what you're doing. I've held this community together for 20 years. Voice from the back by threatening lawsuits and weaponizing fines. Another: "You fined me $300 for leaving my garage door open during a power outage." Marlene's face crumpled, not in guilt, but in fury. "I built this place." Julia met her eyes. "No, you controlled it. There's a difference." A vote was held on the spot. The motion to remove Marlene Whitlock from her position passed unanimously. Her exit wasn't dramatic, no guards, no shouting, just a hollow woman walking out to her golf cart, clipboard clutched to her chest like a life vest. In the weeks that followed, the HOA underwent a massive transformation. A new board was elected, this time with term limits, public oversight, and mandatory financial transparency. Harold took a temporary role as interim president to guide the transition. Julia, as a gesture of goodwill, offered assistance in creating a clear boundary policy to prevent future overreach. But she made one thing clear: "I will never be part of the HOA," she said, "and this cabin stays free." As for Marlene, she was later charged with multiple counts of financial fraud and harassment when she tried to countersue Julia for defamation. The court dismissed the case with prejudice. On the porch of the lake cabin, now fully restored and framed with wildflowers, Julia sat beside me with a contented sigh. The lake shimmered under a sunset sky, quiet once more, not because it was untouched, but because justice had been done. "I didn't come here looking for a fight," she said. "But you finished it," I replied. She smiled. "Some battles are worth picking, and this one was hers from the start."